Hello and welcome to Reiki Women Podcasts. It's Bronwen Logan here, one of the Reiki women from Reiki with Bronwen. And we have Carrie Varela from the Reiki Healing Society and Michaela Daystar from Heartscapes. So we're all here again. And today we are going to have a chat about something which is, I think it's a fascinating subject. It's a difficult subject because there's probably lots of different viewpoints on this. It's about the system of Reiki being a Japanese practice and what that might mean. So are we culturally or spiritually appropriating aspects or the system of Reiki when we are teaching it outside of Japan or without enough Japanese cultural information in it? There's a lot of different stuff in this, and you know, I guess we need to see the context of what we're what is the context of the system of Reiki, and discussing how we best can do that without appropriating this practice. So I know that Carrie and Michaela have in their Integrity series that they recorded, they've actually discussed some of these aspects. So it might be a good thing to begin with that and lead us into further discussion. Michaela.
Yeah, I mean, with all of the topics we talk about, I think particularly with this one, it's really important to just kind of set a baseline context and kind of shared understanding of what it is that we're talking about and how we're defining it. The term cultural appropriation, spiritual appropriation is used in a wide range of ways and, has a range of, ways of understanding it and sometimes ways of misunderstanding it. So just to kind of give us a baseline on how we're addressing it, how we're engaging with it here. Where Carrie and I started, and is a really good place to jump off from, is the definition provided by Mayusha Johnson. She's an award-winning journalist and writer and digital strategist and has done a lot of work in this realm. And she begins with the base definition of spiritual and cultural appropriation as, quote, a particular power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systemically oppressed by that dominant group. And so the important piece here to start with is the idea of a power dynamic, that, people are influenced by each other and, inspired by each other and take pieces of artifacts from culture and artifacts from other people's forms of expression and art and so on all the time. It's a very common way in which humans interact with each other. We inspire each other. We draw from each other to help us understand ourselves and express ourselves, and create everything from fashion to movies to language to spiritual practices. But what's important to pay attention to is whether or not there's a power dynamic between the people involved. And so a simple way of thinking about that is that, are we dealing with a situation where a group of people have experienced oppression or have experienced being kind of held down or restricted in some way in their lives by another group of people? And in that situation, has that dominant group of people then gone in and taken pieces of culture, pieces of art, pieces of expression, medicine, spirituality, and taken those on as if they were their own, almost invariably changing the meaning of those things or erasing the original meaning, original context, perhaps viewing them as unimportant to understand those original contexts, and essentially taking them as if we can do whatever we want with them.
Yeah.
In that instance, you have cultural appropriation. And often we would, kind of go on to look at the ways in which those elements of culture are then monetized, are then, again, scrubbed of their original meaning and context, and used in ways that benefit the dominant culture at the expense of the culture they were taken from. And so in that context, if we look at Reiki as a system of practice, which, here in our modern times has been in the United States for a very long time, since roughly the 1940s, some further layers of context there of where we might see this power dynamic. If we go back to that period of time when Reiki was coming into the US from Japan, it was coming in right in that era of World War II in the 1940s, coming through Hawaii. And in that time, you had Japanese United States citizens who were being imprisoned as a result of fear and paranoia as a result of the war. We were at war with Japan at the time. And while there are legitimate reasons to restrict the movement of people who are coming from a country that we are at war with at wartime, there are not legitimate reasons to imprison United States citizens simply because they share that ancestry. And that was what was happening in very widespread, very dramatic ways in the United States at the time. And because of that dynamic, certain aspects of the system of Reiki had to be significantly suppressed by the people who were first practicing it in Japan, or excuse me, in Hawaii. Notably Hawaii Otakara, the woman who's attributed with bringing Reiki into the United States. Her teacher, Chijiro Hayashi, had some very harrowing experiences that led to his suicide around kind of protecting the Hawaiian Reiki community at that time. And so, as Reiki moved its way into the United States from that place, it had been essentially scrubbed of a lot of the context that was original to the system of Reiki. And then as it took root here in the United States, as we do, we kind of picked it up, dropped it in our melting pot, swirled it around with lots of different practices, lots of different traditions, lots of different points of culture and spirituality, and created a wide range of systems of practice that were very different from its origins, such that it can be really challenging to kind of sort through what actually is the original form, what pieces are authentically Japanese and what pieces are not. And so that's just a little bit of the context, the backdrop of why we might approach this question in this way, and why it matters that, we three Caucasian folk, two of us white Americans, would be concerned with this question, and why that would matter to our Reiki practice, and why we would bother to have a conversation about it with all of you fine people. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Well, I think you point to some of the really deep complexities of this conversation. It's going to ask us to look more closely at race. It's going to ask us to look more closely at oppression and our own relationship with that. And it's an uncomfortable topic. And as a white woman from the United States, I have ancestry from Europe, and why I am where I am today is as a result of colonization. And the historical context that you provided, Michaela, was so beautiful. And that's exactly how, Reiki came to the United States and then, dispersed globally from there. But, it's one part of a massive problem that has been happening in dominant culture for a long period of time, or white dominant culture. And these ideas around colonization have been used as weapons to destroy indigenous cultures. And you can look at, there's this list going of all of the cultures that have been wiped out as a result of colonization. And it's so long, and it's disheartening to see how much, that we've wiped away a lot of indigenous knowledge. And I think that is wrong fundamentally, and I choose to be part of a solution, and to hold more integrity and more care around how we're changing the trajectory of history with these indigenous systems of knowledge. And so that's why it's important to me. But as we discussed in our integrity conversation, it's a spectrum. I mean, some people might not care about this topic at all. And some people might think it's very important, and so much so that you feel uncomfortable as a white person, or insert your own ancestry, to practice Japanese healing art. And I think, either end of that spectrum is probably not the right solution, right? Like, there's somewhere in the middle where we don't have to completely disregard the Japanese origins of Reiki and just make it whatever we want it to. We also don't have to not practice it, because, as we know, the founder of Reiki, he was very generous in his heart. He had the heart to share Reiki with the world, and that was his intention from the outset of Reiki. And that's his legacy, and that's what's happened. And so I think that that's really beautiful. Other indigenous forms of healing, or other forms of healing, let's not just say indigenous, are very specific to specific people. So like hoodoo, for example, is a whole indigenous system of knowledge of healing that's only for hoodoo people. And so I think that that's also really important to respect. But the good news is that the mindset and the heart of the founder of Reiki was to share this gift of Reiki with everyone, and that's what has happened. But yet we still have a lot of what you said, Michaela, a lot of scrubbing, a lot of stripping of this. Really, the Buddhism and these indigenous and Shintoism from Reiki, these concepts that are much deeper than Reiki itself, that the founder of Reiki really infused into the practice. In fact, he took the elements, like the fundamental elements of Shingon Buddhism, Mikao Buddhism, and Shigundo itself, and formed his own healing practice. So to lose that cultural context, I think, is really is where appropriation is happening within Reiki. I think it's also appropriations happening when we're combining Reiki with other systems of knowledge and systems of healing, without bringing those things together really mindfully with the cultural context in hand. I have another example of this. Okay. So my example, I think that is really useful to think about, is that, like, let's say you were really fascinated by the samurai tradition within Japan, right? And you can't study the samurai tradition. You can't completely uproot that tradition from Japan and bring it to another continent and to another place and have it be the same thing. Yet that's kind of what we've done with Reiki. But that's just basically it. It's just that we've taken so much of Reiki, uprooted it from its origins, and just made it into whatever it is that we want to make it into, especially, construed it more towards a Western Christian mindset. And I think, in this day and age, we have the resources to do better. We can do better. And that when we really study the origins and the deeper culture that is really from where Reiki was born, that we get a much greater understanding of the practice. And that's really meaningful to me. And so I hope that in this modern age that we do more of this. We do more of unpacking not only some of our cultural biases, our racist biases, but think more about how we help people to heal, especially those who have been subject to such racism and cultural oppression over the years. If we're not sensitive to that as healers, I think we're not doing the work that's necessary for all of us to heal in this day and age.
Yeah, I think, it's such a beautiful thing to actually learn about another culture. When you talk about that spectrum, Carrie, learning about another culture is such a mind-opening, heart-opening experience. And it's empathy and compassion. So if we are actually working with the Reiki precepts, if we are thinking about compassion, then we are definitely going to want to feel that for not just the technical practices, but for everything that it sits in. So the culture and understanding why Usui started it. If we can understand that, and anything that we can understand, that we can bring that in. I think it comes down to, thanks for giving a definition, Michaela, at the beginning. And I think as far as we're concerned with the system of Reiki, I think it is important for us, I know you'll understand this, like when I started, and people still do it today, oh yeah, I do Reiki. And all they mean is that they are working with, energy. They're doing energy work, and actually has nothing to do with the practices whatsoever. And so, if it's not to do with the practices, it's definitely not to do with the culture behind that, right? So it's totally taken out of that. And when I first started, that's why there were certain things that were very important to me. So language, language is really important. How we use language, how we talk about what we're doing, which is why, I started, using the words like the system of Reiki, because I was trying to define in my head, and also when speaking to other people, what I'm talking about, right? So if I just said Reiki, then I could very easily be misunderstood, because it has been taken out of the Japanese world and plonked in other cultures. And people don't know then what I'm actually referring to. So really trying to refine my own language in a way to be very certain about that I'm talking about these practices, and these practices come out of this culture. And then, even just defining what those practices are. So, for example, I was just thinking as you were talking about poetry, we don't really teach, not a lot, maybe I think more these days, but there hasn't been a lot of teaching of the poetry that the Meiji Emperor's poetry that Mikao Usui did bring into the system of Reiki. It's something of its time. Most martial arts, I think, probably don't teach poetry in their martial arts anymore, and yet at the beginning of the 1900s it was quite a popular practice for martial artists to work with poetry. It works at a deeper subconscious level. It helps us to it uses metaphor to help us understand ourselves differently. So it's a really clever use of something in a practice to help us become to work on changing ourselves. And poetry, so we don't use it as much today, though, like I said, it's coming back around. Interesting, because as I'm just talking, right, as I'm thinking, like, is it because we culturally across the world possibly aren't as interested anymore? So is it of a time? Yes. And it's also of a culture, though, so because it is actual Japanese poetry. But we could, I guess, I don't know, could we use Western poetry? Would that be an appropriation of some sort to bring Western poetry into the system of Reiki? There's a lot of things I think that are unclear, and I think they need to be discussed. We need to find out how we do, how we should do things that are going to be sensitive, respectful. Some of my thoughts.
I think your point about language use is so important. And this is one of these places where the incredible efficiency of our brains and our ability to quickly categorize and simplify information so that we can navigate the vast amount of information in our world, like, this is a skill that we have as humans. It's part of our survival strategy. It's part of why we've thrived as a species. And it can get us into trouble when we're in these spaces of complexity and subtlety. And so your example around how we use the word Reiki, and you gave kind of two different types of examples, is really important. Firstly, I have observed that the word Reiki is used pretty interchangeably with the more general category of energy work. So there's energy work, right? Big, broad category, consciously interfacing with the body's or the natural world's energy system in some way. And then there's numerous systems of practice that have been developed in specific times and places to do energy work, right? And so Reiki is one example of that, developed in a very specific time, a very specific place, within a specific culture, a specific historical moment. The word Reiki is not synonymous with energy work. Energy work is the much bigger category that Reiki is a subcategory of. Yet the word Reiki is often used synonymously with energy work and is applied to a lot of different practices of energy work, some of which are codified and others of which are general, intuitively developed, because we all have the ability to intuitively develop some form of energy work, right? This is part of our human capacity. Whether or not we've learned a specific system of practice or not, we have this capacity. And so a lot of people, who have some experience intuitively working with energy and then have heard the word Reiki will naturally bring those together and say, oh, I do Reiki, or I've naturally been doing Reiki, and now I want to learn more about it specifically. And so, what I would offer as a refinement there is that you naturally have found your way into energy work. You have followed your own intuition, your own sensitivities, your observations of the world. You have engaged in something that we as humans absolutely have the capacity for, that enriches our life, that we, benefit from engaging in on all levels. You have not been working the system of Reiki, right? Because that is a specific system of principles and practices, contexts, cultural origins that came in a particular time and place. The other example that you gave of distinguishing the word Reiki, spiritual energy, that has existed in Japan long before Mikao Usui's time, that's been used within spiritual context in Japan long before this system that we're working with was developed, and the system of practice that was developed by Mikao Usui in the 1800s and early 1900s. So again, a level of specificity that matters when we're wanting to be in good integrity with a practice and good effectiveness with that practice, because how much is lost when we export just parts of something, misunderstand those parts, don't understand the subtlety of those parts, ascribe totally different meaning to those parts, which absolutely has happened, particularly with the symbols and mantras and with the practice of Reiju. Ascribing totally different meanings to those elements based on our Western understanding of the world, and then carrying on as if that is the way that it should be. What gets lost in that practice? And what can we gain in not only integrity, but also effectiveness when we reclaim those origins and really pay attention, because words do in fact matter. There's times when it's okay to generalize. There's times when it's not. And this is one of those times. And to kind of bring another analogy in, I've seen similar conversations start to happen within pagan communities, because again, you have this word pagan that is kind of this, larger word. And then you have Wicca, and you have Druidism, and you have, Eastern European folk religions, and you have spiritual practices coming from all over Europe, which is a huge landmass with many, many, many cultures and lots of, history, right? And to simply paint all of them with the brush of Wicca or pagan is not accurate, and it's not specific, and it's not in honoring and in good alignment with the specific times and places that certain practices came from. And, again, that matters not only for honoring those traditions and being in good alignment with those traditions, but being effective with how we apply those systems of practice. We look at the word shaman, right? This is a word that's applied, across all cultures, right? It has become the word that we kind of indiscriminately apply to pretty much any nature-based animistic kind of practice, and lump all of those practices into a pretty narrow set of practices that is common among many of them, that was codified into what's known as core shamanism. And then we call all of that shamanism. And then inside of that melting pot of shamanism, we can drop all kinds of things in there and melt them down and blend them together. But it matters to know that the word shaman itself is itself a colonial word, right? It's the mispronunciation of the Siberian word for the medicine person of that culture that was mispronounced by Russian colonists who came into that space and then was exported. And so, I mean, I'm a history major. Like I go down these rabbit holes like pretty deeply. Not everybody has to do that, but just these little pieces of context can help us to refine how we think about our relationship with these practices that matter to us. And I would argue vastly improve those relationships.
Yeah. So what do you think about the question about poetry? So we could, for example, right? So we could do, so a student of Mikao Usui, yeah, we have a book of his. And in the book, he has a practice called Hatsureiho. Yeah. Now, his version of Hatsureiho is slightly different to the version that we know through the Usui Reiki Ryoho Gaku. And in it, he contemplates poetry. And it's beautiful, right? And can we use other poetry, do you think? Do we need to use Japanese poetry? Do we need to use the poetry of the Meiji Emperor? What do you guys think?
I love this question. I'm sorry, I'm just jumping in here again. I get
Hang on a second, Michaela.
Um,
Michaela, stop for a sec. Good old Siri is at it today. She just talked through you. Sorry, darling. Just if you want to just start answering. Yep.
Yeah, I think this is a really excellent question of refinement. And it's one of these questions that doesn't have a straight correct answer. It's one of these things that we each get to come to from our own perspective. Carrie, you mentioned a spectrum of relationship with this topic, from you should never engage in somebody else's culture at all ever, to it doesn't matter, take what you want, do what you want with it, right? Like those are the extremes. And then there's all the shades of gray in between. And when it comes to modification of something to bring it into our, modern context, this is a place for some subtlety, and it's a place where we all get to make our own choices, right? And so, the way that I would approach that question in that particular example, and have, because I work with poetry in my Reiki classes, is in a couple of different ways. First, that it's my responsibility to know as much as I can about the original application of poetry in Reiki, and to have source material of those original poems. Now, luckily, we have them. Like we have poems from the Meiji Emperor. We have various translations of those poems. We have them in the original Japanese. We have them in translated form. Obviously, things get lost in the translation. So already, when you go from the original Japanese to a translated English version, something has been lost, something's been shifted, changed, the context is different, and we don't have the full kind of cultural relationship with what those poems would have meant. We can learn more and more and more about that according to our interest. But I would say we need to have at least a basic core understanding of why poems were included in the first place, and what was the general tone, purpose, focus of those poems themselves. From there, I would say practice with those poems, right? Incorporate them. I have certainly done that. Then the question of, okay, with that basic understanding, or maybe deep understanding of the context of poetry in the Meiji Restoration, and therefore inside of Reiki, and I've worked with some poems within that context, and I have a relationship with all of that, the purpose for it and the original form. Now, if I say, okay, in my 2023 American context, does it make sense to bring in poetry that is from my time and place and to apply it in the same way, to apply the same contemplation practices, allow them to work on my insides in the way that those original poems may have done? For me, the answer is yes. Because I have a relationship with the purpose of why they're there. I've worked with the original form. I understand that the translated version of the Meiji poems that I work with is already different, has already been changed. And I'm applying the same structure of practice when I am taking on those poems. Now I narrow the type of poetry that I use. So I try to stay with the same kind of poetry that draws heavily on nature images and that applies nature metaphors to spirituality. So there's particular poets like John O'Donohue that do that quite a bit. There's a wide range of American and European poems that do a similar thing, applying natural metaphor to esoteric spiritual experiences that we have with the world, and that have been really wonderful to apply those practices to. So that's how I've answered that particular question. But that's not the right answer. That's my answer. Another person could say, nope, you use Meiji poems, period, end of story. And that would be also a legitimate answer.
Or what about, Carrie, maybe you want to answer this one as well. What about not doing any poetry? Would that be right or wrong?
Well, I think the danger there of not doing any poetry is this extinction power of, like, then your students don't do poetry and those students don't do poetry. And then at some point, generations beyond us in the world of Reiki don't know that Reiki and poetry go together. And so I think that's the concern for me. Yeah. But I think what, Michaela just walked us through, it's a really elegant example of knowing your why. Know your why of why you combine Reiki with poetry. And maybe it's a different question. I mean, I think the rub for me sometimes is combining different symbols to the Reiki practice. Some person might do that and combine, add extra symbols to the world of Reiki. I particularly don't think that that's appropriate, but I do know that symbols have power. Symbols have meaning, symbols have deep cultural context. And if you understand those well, perhaps it is important for you to bring those together. So for me, when I have kind of gone through and analyzed my why, some of it shows up in how I choose to teach Reiki. And I think that that's really important, because then we're starting to talk about, well, how is this lineage and how is this knowledge being disseminated through generations to future generations of Reiki students. And so I think it's very important for me to have a lot of integrity of how I teach Reiki. And in that context, I don't teach symbols outside of the system of Reiki, because I don't think that's appropriate. But to know that that's there, of course it's there, and then I leave it to my students to evaluate their why and teach the way that feels most authentic and aligned for them. And hopefully I'm leading by example there. But then there's another hierarchy for me, is when I'm working one-to-one with a client. And I feel like, this would be really helpful for you. And I know it's outside of the context of Reiki, but I think it would help you. So it's there for you, and when I'm working with people one-to-one, or just there for somebody in the role of healer, I choose to bring everything that I have, within me to the table to support them in their healing process, whether it be from Reiki or from otherwise. But when I'm teaching Reiki, I'm teaching Reiki. When I'm teaching yoga, I'm teaching yoga, because those are the practices that, you came to me for. So I think that that's very important to me. And I really also, just going back a couple topics, I love the breakdown, Michaela, that you had about shamanism, because I think shamanism is also a very sticky topic. And one thing that I just add to that I don't think you mentioned is that, this umbrella term shamanism is a lot of times used as a guise for disguising indigenous forms of healing, and then giving people this license to just take that indigenous form of healing without permission. And so if there is an indigenous community that's holding those cultural traditions, that in order to practice them as a white person or a person outside of their community, then you need permission. You need permission from that community really to be doing that. And then you shouldn't be calling yourself a shaman. You should be using the name that they use, to describe that. And that's integrity in my point of view. And I think another layer of this is it's also about just the subtle racism that's existing within healing communities, and that it isn't odd that we are 3 white women, and that a lot of healing communities, some have been labeled as white spiritual utopias, where it's just a bunch of white people running around being white people and not taking ownership of the way in which these kind of ingrained superiority complexes are impacting people of color and indigenous communities, and in such a way that there's not a lot of Asian American people practicing Reiki, and I think that that's unfortunate. And so for me, one of the things that I really try to be aware of as I'm teaching Reiki is, if somebody was from a Japanese origin, would they feel comfortable in my class? Would they feel like they're connecting to their culture, or would they be feeling like they're connecting to this very whitewashed version of Reiki that has nothing of the essence of their culture within it? And I think that that's really unfortunate. And so I'm trying to change, just to open that space and to hold space for all different types of people, because in order to do that, we really have to look more closely at our own story of race and superiority. Many of these conversations, many of these different nuances that we're tapping into in this conversation, for sure. So,
I think we can rationalize doing anything, because I see people, that's what we do, right? Humans are just really great at rationalizing, and therefore doing stuff that we shouldn't be doing, and yet finding a good reason for why we do that, or what we think is a good reason for doing that. Good question that you just asked, Carrie, is would a Japanese person be comfortable in my class? And I do often think about that. That's just a really interesting thing. It's like when I'm talking about something, I think, do I know enough about this subject to actually be talking about this subject? Yeah. And if that's the case, what do I do about that? Well, I can research that subject more. Yeah. I could leave that subject out, but then what am I doing? Right. So, once again, we're always having to think about quite deeply about what we're doing when we're with others, and how we are bringing that across. When I first started, like I got the first class I didn't even know that this was a Japanese practice. There was nothing about that. And in fact, I think it might have had something about Tibetan culture in it. And, that's just incredibly confusing. And you can see then sort of like where the system of Reiki has gone and is going. And I really love the fact that you guys, for example, did the integrity program that you've done, talking about these sorts of things and trying to help people to understand why, it is actually important for us to know what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that why is also a great one. It's not just knowing the why of a specific thing. It's also, why would I change it? And I think, Carrie, you did sort of mention that before, You brought some of those elements in. So, and Michaela, it was your why originally, right? So why are we doing this? But why would we change it? If we're teaching something that is a cultural practice, because it is a cultural practice, it's like you said, samurai, you can't take the samurai out of Japan. You really can't take the system of Reiki out of Japan, because the symbols and the mantras, we need to understand what these things are. Reiju, we need to understand what that is. If we don't understand these things, then we aren't practicing what I would consider to be the system of Reiki. And I don't want to be that person on the other end of the spectrum who says, well, I'm not the other person on the other end of the spectrum, because I can't be, because I'm me. I'm not Japanese, you know. So but I do think that we need to have a deep understanding and a deep respect. And I'm sure most people would agree with that. But we need to always check back on ourselves. Why would we change something? Do we think that we can do it better? Is that what that is? You know, what is our rationalization for changing something?
Yeah.
Well, I think it is such a good question. Sorry to jump in and answer it, but I think if you look back at the context of Reiki, especially from Miss Takata Sensei's passing in 1980, is that Reiki has become commercialized and people are making a living off of doing Reiki, and so that they feel this need to change or modify the teachings in order to get more students that can listen to it, that are there, that want spiritual healing, but maybe aren't willing to actually look at Buddhism, or look outside of their own religious context. And so that's where spiritual appropriation and capitalism really start to butt heads. And and so I think sometimes inside of that, it's, you have to recognize that by doing things with complete integrity isn't always the most monetarily lucrative way of
Typically
doing.
not.
Typically not. And so, the changes that have happened within Reiki is to make it more accessible to a Western mind. And that's so much of why Takata changed so many of the different elements of Reiki, not only because of World War II, but also because of capitalism. And so I think that that's a big part of it, is why we should change. Why should we change it? Well, that's why people feel drawn to change it, and so to me, it really comes down to training people in Reiki better and not giving people the license and the keys to teach Reiki after they've completed Reiki 3. I mean, if you've just done Reiki 1 through 3, or, any other different level, I don't think that you're ready to go back and teach it to other people. I think you need time to embody it. I think you need to apprentice with a Reiki teacher. I think you need time to, and I learn a lot by teaching. So, when I've come up against those edges of I don't really know that much about this topic, and I'm going to feel really uncomfortable teaching it, and so my own integrity, it tells me, okay, I got to go research this and I got to study it more. And that's how I've grown as a teacher, with so many different iterations of taking Reiki training. So I respect that people learn that way, but I think that the whole culture around, just get all the way through Reiki 3, and then you're going to be doing treatments, and then you're going to be making money doing Reiki after 6 months or whatever. That kind of mindset is toxic. And I think we need to take a step back at it. I think the whole Reiki community as a whole should think about, let's put a little bit more bumpers around what really gives somebody the skill, the expertise, the knowledge to teach other people in Reiki. And I think if we were able to create a little more standards around that, we'll do so much for the whole system of Reiki, the whole practice of Reiki.
Yeah, I think that's such an important piece. And, as we've discussed in other conversations, there isn't any regulatory body for the system of Reiki as of yet. And so self-regulation is, what we have. And so I think what we're advocating here is that we apply the lens of spiritual appropriation to our self-regulation, and that we, take on a mindset of responsibility around that. And I also want to acknowledge that the vast majority of Reiki practitioners aren't actively making changes to the system that they learned. They learned a system that had already been changed, right? And they don't necessarily know that. I'm sure the two of you and others listening have had the experiences that I've had, where we start talking about Reiki from its origins, and people who have been practicing Reiki, who have taken classes, are like, I had no idea. Like, I had no idea the chakra system was not original to Reiki. I had no idea that, certain elements that I learned were not original to the system. I didn't know. Right. And so, there are people actively making changes, certainly creating new systems that are personalized. The vast majority of people, however, are simply taught a system that they take on and they take it at face value. And I think part of this notion of taking responsibility for taking on a system of practice that has weight and significance is to go a little bit beyond the face value of what we're given, and to do a little bit more digging around. I would want my students to do that as well. They don't have to take what I say at face value either. Do a little bit more digging. And, for me, I've told the story here before of, getting to this point in my Reiki journey when I was, maybe a couple of years in, having studied what I would now call traditional Western Reiki. At the time was simply Usui Reiki. And feeling this sense of dissatisfaction around not having those direct points of connection, of knowledge to the Japanese origins. Like, I know this is a Japanese system, but I've been given this story that doesn't feel right, that doesn't feel like it's accurate. And I don't know what the actual context for any of these pieces that I've learned is. And there doesn't seem to be any avenue for finding that information here where I'm studying. And I did almost give it up. I kind of went to that extreme of saying, well, if I can't find it, and I'm not going to do it the way I am doing it now. And since I can't find those threads of knowledge, then I'm going to give it up. Now, really, that was a little bit lazy, because even if I didn't have the points of context around Reiki, I could certainly study Japan. I could certainly have studied more about the time and place that Reiki was developed in, and now I have. But ultimately, I did find the thread that led me to your writing, Bronwen, and to what the research that you had been doing for a long time, and other thinkers and other writers who had been doing the same. And that kind of gave me that foothold to say, okay, here's a path that I can walk where I can take more responsibility for these pieces. Not to do it perfectly, but to do it at all. And I think that's really what I'd like to leave with you, dear listener, is that this conversation is complex. It has subtlety. It can be very messy. There's no right answer. The way that we have answered these questions for ourselves in our practice is not necessarily how you will answer it, and that's okay. The important piece is that we have the conversation, that we think about these issues, we wrestle with them, we bring them into our practice and make our own decisions about what feels right, and to do that in integrity with our colleagues.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we wrote the Reiki source book. It was very much exactly what you were saying. I didn't try to make it judgmental. It was really just, what are people teaching, and putting it all in one space, so that, it was just my own evolution of trying to work out what things were, where things came from, how things fitted together, and put that all into one sort of picture. And, I'm really proud of that. And, it really helped me. And I know it's helped other people too. So I'm really proud of that. And thanks for bringing that up. And
absolutely, it's always on my bibliography for my students.
Anyway, we have to go. So thank you so much, Michaela and Carrie, for the beautiful words, and putting more story behind this, because it is such a difficult thing to understand, and it can be very uncomfortable to talk about. I appreciate us sharing that.
Can I mention one more thing?
Yes,
Is that Michaela and I put a lot of heart and soul in making this document. It's a self-reflection and journaling worksheet that offers 6 strategies to build more cultural integrity in your Reiki practice. And so you can get a free download to it. We'll leave that link in the show notes. And so I think it's a really good resource for you if you're really grappling with these issues. And also to just feel free to reach out with us, because I know I went through kind of a dark night of the soul when all of this happened. And like when I really confronted this aspect within Reiki, it was really challenging for me, and I felt kind of alone in it. And luckily I found friends like you in the process, it's been really beautiful. But we'd love to hear from you if you're really struggling with these questions and trying to find your authentic expression of Reiki inside of that. So love to hear from you.
So do share this video with your community, and because we'd love to hear what they have to say as well. Yeah, it's a good thing to get out there and for people to think about. So like it, share it, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.